with us Caitlin. We have with us Caitlin Chase, our program director, and we have Dr. Fiona Hill. I think most of you know her if you've already signed up, but just by a brief way of introduction, she's at the Brookings Institution. She's the Bosch Senior Fellow for the United States and Europe. Previously, she was at the National Security Council, the Senior Director for Europe and Russian Affairs. From 2006 to 2009, she was the Russia and Eurasia Director at the National Intelligence Council. She's the author of Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. If you've not read this, get it. It is the single best illustration, not just of President Putin, but of the milieu that he operates in and rules Russia through. She's also a Belfer alum, so we're really happy to have her back to the Harvard Kennedy School and Belfer Center. With that, let me turn over to Caitlin very briefly, just to provide some rules of the road and run of show, and then we'll turn over to Dr. Hill, who will provide a couple of comments. I've got a million questions, others will. I'll just open up with one, and it's her thoughts on the trajectory of Russia and U.S. relations since you started looking at Russia. Fiona, what's been different than you expected, and why? And just maybe 3 or 4 minutes on that, and then we'll launch into discussion and questions. Caitlin, over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Dr. Hill, for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you. We have a few ground rules for this event. Even though this event is on the record, our policy prohibits any attendees, including journalists, from audiovisual recording or distributing parts or all of the event program without prior written authorization. We will start by having Dr. Hill give a few remarks, and then once we open it up to Q&A, I direct the audience to type your question into the Q&A box, and we'll get to them as they are received. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Hill. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you as well, Caitlin, and also Paul and everybody else who's participating, and happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. And Paul has asked me a kind of question, which I could go on forever, because I started studying Russian in 1984. And it was against the backdrop of the Euro missiles crisis over the stationing of SS-20s and Pershing missiles in Europe. And, you know, that was the kind of period just before Gorbachev was coming in. And obviously, at the time, well, you know, where we were kind of reliving in many respects, for those of those who had already gone through it before, the atmosphere of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So for, you know, anyone who'd been a young person during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you know, their whole life was, you know, seemingly framed by crises and, you know, the prospect of nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union. So it was very much the superpower confrontation. And I was, you know, in school trying to figure out what to do when it was the peak of the war scare in 82, 83. And, you know, decided that the logical thing, you know, was to study Russian and try to figure out, you know, what was going on. Now, that kind of takes me sort of fast forward to the period when I was at the National Security Council, because, you know, as I said, the whole perspective that I had coming into studying Russian was very much framed by this war scare and the nuclear confrontation. And during the time that I was at the National Security Council, arms control was still at the very top of the agenda. So in some respects, you know, getting back to you, your question about what's changed and what hasn't, what did I not expect, you know, we're still framed by that existential threat of nuclear weapons. It's evolved over time. I studied in the Soviet Union as an exchange student once I got to university in 87, 88. I got there just at the time when Gorbachev and Reagan were already in the prime of their symmetry. I was there for the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, to be signed in 1987, and there when Gorbachev and Reagan had their famous Moscow summit in 1988. I kind of expected that time that, you know, maybe peace might break out all over, or maybe not, of course, but, you know, it certainly seemed extremely promising at the end of the 1980s. But then in my time in the National Security Council, I actually presided over, in part, the unraveling of the INF Treaty. Russia had been violating it for a long time, but the decision was made while I was there that the United States should pull out, because the United States was the only country adhering to this. And by that time, the world has changed. It's become much more complex. So it's not just the nuclear standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States, and it's not just the other nuclear powers of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, China, the UK, and France. It's so many other nuclear powers and so many wannabe nuclear powers. Not just India and Pakistan in the intermediate range, but China now developing strategic nuclear weapons, obviously North Korea, hell-bent on getting a nuclear capability to potentially strike at the United States and hold, the whole Asia Pacific region to nuclear blackmail. Iran on a similar trajectory in its neighborhood, and many other countries that might have, clandestine nuclear programs that certainly have the desires and aspirations. So the whole nuclear proliferation regime has changed as well in that time frame. So we're still dealing with a lot of the older problems. But in the meantime, we've gone into new domains. It's not just the sort of conventional standoff between Russia and the United States anymore either. It's not the nuclear, but we're now in contention in cyberspace. And we've seen the evolution, very sadly, of things that we kind of maybe thought in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that things might go in a different direction, of new forms of confrontation with Russia. We just got the report that was released from the Director of National Intelligence, your and my old home, kind of back in the day, looking at Russia's continued efforts to interfere in the elections in 2020, on top of the major interference in 2016, which is again part of a Cold War pattern. There have been plenty of times when Russia, the Soviet Union, has tried to influence elections in the United States and elsewhere, but with less successful, let's say less successful impact in terms of really getting our attention, because the tools just weren't there. So what's changed is the tools. What hasn't changed, very sadly, is really the kind of pattern of these relationships, and the fact that we still find ourselves in confrontation with Russia like we did with the Soviet Union. And I think, as we go on through this discussion, we could ask ourselves why. I mean, I think personally, it's something of a Greek tragedy, because, certainly when I started studying Russian in 1984, again, a great concern about where the relationship was heading. But the whole of the late 1980s, the Gorbachev period, and then for a lot of the 1990s, when I was working at the Balfour Centre with Graham Allison and, all of our other colleagues on strengthening democratic institutions, we kind of thought that Russia might, at least be heading in something of a different direction, and that we'd be able to take the edge off the confrontation. And of course, we've seen that hasn't happened. So I'll leave it at that. And then, we can talk more, I think, about all these different issues.
Thanks, Fiona. I'll just start with two questions, and then we'll turn over to the audience. So one specific and one general. The general one is referring back to kind of your trajectory of your career looking at Russia and that period of hope when peace might break out. And that there was, after the Soviet Union fell, and in that period in the early mid-90s, I think there was quite a bit of optimism and expectation on both sides that there was going to be a very different relationship and very different world than we see now, right? That Russia would join the family of nations, might even join in the West, would become a democratic state, would adopt a democratic capitalism, and would may even join NATO at some point. That all, you look back on that and it feels kind of naive and misplaced. With now at a point where there's deep bitterness and hostility on both sides, and it feels like so fundamental in so many areas as you go through the litany of areas where our interests clash or we have fundamental disagreements. What are some of the main factors in that? And I'll just note that the title of this session was called "The Problem with Russia," which by itself is a bit pejorative because it implies that the problem is all with Russia. Right. And not any of our or others' doings. Can you talk about just what are some of the core elements you see of what are the foundations of that hostility and bitterness now?
Yeah, and as you say, Paul, the Russians would say, "What do you mean the problem with us? The problem's with you." So that in itself encapsulates, some of the dilemma that we have, because I think we had perhaps too much in the way of kind of exuberance and high expectations as the Cold War drew to an end. And certainly from our perspective, and the whole United States narrative about the Cold War is that we won and Russia, the Soviet Union, lost. And of course, it seemed fairly self-evident. The Soviet Union literally disappeared from the stage as a state. I mean, it didn't, of course, completely disappear because all of the constituent parts of the Soviet Union are still with us, but obviously in different forms, and Russia became the successor state. But so for Russia, there was a sense of feeling of loss on two fronts, not just in this, sort of, in a way, virtual conflict that, sort of still playing out today, but also loss in the meaningful sense of territory, the kind of thing that only happens as a result of defeat in war, which actually happened for Russia earlier on in the 20th century. In 1917, with the Russian Revolution, at the time where they did lose in a physical kinetic war during World War One against Germany and Austro-Hungary and the other Axis powers. So, kind of as Vladimir Putin has said, the great catastrophe of the 21st century, the loss, the collapse of the Russian state, that being twice. So this sort of perception of not having gained anything, whereas all of the other republics of the former Soviet Union that became sovereign states as a result of this, independent states, they gained something. So for Russia, there's this perpetual sense of loss. And we thought, yeah, we've gained something too. We've gained a peace dividend. We can just get Russia, as you mentioned before, just to join in all of the institutions, because it seems, from our perspective that, our system, our way won out. They collapsed, they literally disappeared and fell apart. So obviously, our institutions were superior. We've got all the narratives about this was, the result of SDI, not strengthening democratic institutions, a program we had at the Belfer Center, but, the Strategic Defense Initiative and all of the arms control and the arms race, we'd prevailed, the strength of our conventional forces and the strength of our way of life and our model, the capitalist Western model. So we believed then it would be self-evident that Russia would just, kind of accept all of this. Remember Francis Fukuyama, end of history, we'd all be a part of all the same institutions together, not just the international institutions at the end of World War II, but the institutions that we'd created over the course of the Cold War. And, we expected, as you said, that maybe perhaps Russia might even consider being part of NATO. But from Russia's perspective, this was, kind of an imposed peace. There's been many debates about this, of course, and we can pass this out and people will have a lot of disagreements. But if you kind of trace through the thinking in many Russian circles, and particularly the circles that Vladimir Putin comes out of, which is most important because he's the president of Russia at this point and all the cohorts around him, they come out of that sense of having lost something, lost position, lost their own identity as, Soviet citizens, or masters of half the world anyway, in terms of that, bipolar superpower standoff. And, they don't really feel that they've gained anything at all, apart from chaos through the point of the 1990s. And then you see NATO starts to enlarge, get 1999 and, the wars of Yugoslav succession, and then the United States and NATO intervene in Serbia against Milosevic and, the carnage in Kosovo and, all the way around Bosnia-Herzegovina and all around Yugoslavia. And that's the first evidence that Russia sees of NATO flexing its muscles in the new arena. And because there's sort of the perception that Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union have a lot of parallels, which of course is true as well, and, part of the same bloc, there's that feeling that, well, if NATO can take action in an internal conflict in former Yugoslavia, why can't it do something similar here? Because we also have Chechnya and other, conflicts of post-Soviet succession going on inside of Russia itself and around in the periphery. And I happened to be in St. Petersburg at the very time of the strikes as part of work that I was doing with the Belfer Center at the time. We had a conference there, and everyone, including, the people that we would have described as the pro-Western, kind of liberal, these are our labels, politicians like Grigory Yavlinsky, who was a close associate of our project at Belfer, they were in shock, total shock. And they really kind of felt that that was kind of a major rupture, and just in their whole thinking, because then how could they explain, to Russians and to the hardline people around them that in fact the whole dynamic had changed dramatically. So that's kind of one of those threshold points. There are many others along the way. The disillusionment with democratization, because it kind of was wrapped up in the whole failure of a lot of the sort of shock therapy and then economic reform. The rule of law didn't, kind of take hold in the same way. We kind of thought that we could just tinker with the Russian, kind of political system at the top level, help create political parties and open up free media, and we didn't pay a lot of attention to the problems of democracy delivering. And in the 1990s, of course, Russia's lost their jobs en masse. It wasn't just the collapse of the state, collapse of heavy industry, masses of people not knowing what on earth, was going to come next, pensions not paid, the country's completely and utterly bankrupt. And so that ends up with a repudiation of Western-style democracy on top of the repudiation of Soviet-style communism that had happened at the very beginning of the 1990s. So in 10 years, you have the repudiation of pretty much everything, and a very jaundiced and really kind of dark view about what was happening that the NATO strike in Yugoslavia plays into. And from there on, you get the people around Putin projecting onto everything else that happens this dark view that nothing has changed at all, that the United States has no good intentions, that all it was is supposed to be an imposed peace, you know, kind of kicking them when they're down, and a desire emerging for a kind of a geopolitical revision. And again, fast forward to, you know, my time in the government trying to deal with Russian interlocutors, and they're still convinced that we're locked into the same geopolitical struggle that we were, you know, back in the day. Ukraine seen as a proxy war, Venezuela starting to be seen as a proxy war, Syria, you know, as a proxy war. And, you know, no matter how we try to say, look, the times have changed, they don't buy it. And for Putin, we're all about change, yes, but regime change, his regime going out, because we've intervened not just in Yugoslavia against Milosevic, but then after then it's 2003, Saddam Hussein, you know, kind of we talk about removing Assad, Gaddafi in Libya, and on and on and on. And so there are so many ways in which this has kind of played to their worst perceptions of the United States. And, you know, yes, we could have been pretty mindful of that, but, you know, to some extent, it's kind of also a sort of a cautionary tale of raising expectations and then not being kind of mindful along the way of how things play out. And the one thing is that Putin has been in power for 20 years, but we keep changing. You know, we changed the guy on top. We, you know, change all the kind of like the people at the working level as well in time, and they don't have the same interlocutors over and over again. And so there's no kind of people around really to kind of be able to explain this kind of big picture, you know, to Russia. And instead, there's always this kind of perception that everyone is just out to get them in different ways as, you know, kind of we move forward.
Thanks, Fiona. The specific question is on the report that was released yesterday, declassified yesterday. And my impression was that the headline was far more dramatic than the content. So I was struck by what wasn't in there. So I was struck by it that they specifically distinguish between election interference, i.e. messing with election systems, votes, et cetera, and influence. And so they said there was no interference. They didn't try to change the results, but they tried to influence them. And they specifically didn't use the word covertly influence. They just said using proxies linked to the Kremlin, tried to, you know, inject Kremlin messages and viewpoints into it. For me, that didn't sound much different than what any other nation does in any sort of jockeying in an election period. But I just wanted to get your kind of thoughts and views and reactions to the report.
Yeah, so now, first of all, I just want to make a disclaimer that I've only read the newspaper reporting of it. So I haven't, there was a link online, and I didn't have a chance in actual fact to go and, you know, look at all of that. So, you know, what I say here has to be taken, you know, with a certain degree of caution. Because so I'll just be really reacting to, you know, what you said here as well. So I was just changing my view because suddenly I got myself spotlighted there, and all I could see was myself talking. So I've gone back to looking at you and Caitlin. Sorry about that. On that top level, just as you said, that was my reaction as well, Paul. That's not a lot of difference from what we've seen before, and it's really not a lot of difference from what the Soviet Union was trying to do during the Cold War, not just against the United States, but against, you know, the United Kingdom or the European, countries, for example. But of course, you know, their ability to really get traction was more limited in the past, because you'd have to find ways of getting articles into newspapers, find ways of influencing reporters, you know, finding ways of, you know, making pathways up to, political figures and political parties. Where, you know, here all you have to do is get a few bots and, take over, you know, some computers, or, you know, buy some ads on Facebook and, you know, other social media platforms, or do what we know that they did in 2016, which is have an entity like the Internet Research Agency, you know, run by Mr. Prigozhin, Putin's, you know, former chef or the head of the Kremlin catering company, who's branched out in all kinds of less than delicious ways than he used to, you know, be focused on before, who is, you know, basically slicing and dicing, you know, US public opinion and kind of figuring out what they can amplify in terms of helping to sow more discord. But the whole point is that they're not inventing any of these divisions. They're not inventing any of the problems and any of the issues in the United States. they're just riding the wave of basically dissonance and dissent and fractiousness in US politics. So they'll just amplify something that's kind of maximized to do harm to whoever it is that they might be targeting. We shouldn't be in the slightest bit surprised that they would be targeting Joe Biden. I mean, they've been doing that since he was vice president and the Obama period. Just like they did with Hillary Clinton in 2016. There's no kind of desire on their part to have an administration filled with people who have long experience of dealing with Russia, particularly with a sort of a more harsh outlook on the kind of prospects or the realistic prospects for any kind of change in the relationship. I mean, a Biden was vice president during the Obama era's attempts at a reset, which actually went nowhere. I mean, partly because it was done with Dmitry Medvedev and then Vladimir Putin came back in. But, kind of nonetheless, the Russians know that there'll be no surprises with Biden. He is what he is, and he'll do what he says, or he will, try to in some way. And Putin himself said that there was a general preference for Donald Trump the first time around, and would continue to be the second time around. And he said it quite explicitly because Trump has said that he wants to improve relations with Russia, and also because they frankly enjoyed the chaos in US politics over the last 4 years. They told me that, and others directly. They liked the fact that the president was in one place and everybody else seemed to be not just here but everywhere, and that we couldn't get our act together to coordinate a response against them. Although there was an awful lot of sanctions actions taken, not just by Congress, but also by the US Treasury and all kinds of other actions taken to push back about what they'd done in 2016. But the idea that the US was kind of losing its international standing because of all the discord, our inability to deal with COVID, all the barriers that we had to collective action was extraordinarily useful for Russia. They also liked, of course, the fact that President Trump had a pretty dark view of NATO, in the sense of burden sharing and Europeans not stepping up, that there was an open rift with Germany, which Russia has long hoped to prize away from the United States going back to the Cold War period, like the growing rift with Turkey, which is extraordinarily useful for them when they're playing around in the Middle East. So there was a lot to like about the kind of a continuation in their view of a Trump administration, although there was great frustration on their part, which was also evident, that their inability to make new deals on arms control. So, the decision of the Biden administration to extend New START for 5 years, that was actually something that the Russians actually wanted. It doesn't solve, all of the problems. It leaves everything else on the stage. But again, there's no surprise here that the Russians would want to damage Biden and his candidacy as much as possible, kind of play up Trump's, but just generally get in the mix. And they benefited enormously, the Russian security services. I mean, the guys probably got loads of medals and bonuses and free vacations, probably until the pandemic hit, for in fact making it look as if they had actually influenced the outcome of the election in 2016. And we played right into their hands by essentially, many commentators saying they had, and that Trump was illegitimate, that he was elected by Vladimir Putin. That was just like, big bonuses and big medals for the various guys in the security services, and probably even more of a payout for Prigozhin and the Internet Research Agency.
The lucky ones got the timeshares in Sochi, and the unlucky ones got the timeshares in Novosibirsk.
Yes, an extended timeshare.
Caitlin, let's turn over to questions from the audience. Take us away.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hill. Our first question is going to be from Professor Matt Bunn. Matt, I'm going to allow you to go live.
Hey, Fiona, how are you? It's great to see you.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a sort of where do we go from here kind of question. And it seems to me there's this difficulty of balancing pushing back on the Russians over their behavior with cooperating in areas where it would serve our interest. And in particular, there's a bunch of stuff that's cut off right now that was going on perfectly happily when there were, Soviet troops killing people in Afghanistan and our funded mujahideen killing their troops. Various forms of scientific cooperation, various forms of military to military dialogue, etc. I personally am of the view that it was a mistake to cut some of those things off as part of the 2014 sanctions package, because I don't think they hurt the Russians very much, but they do help us at least a little. But I'm wondering whether you think there's any prospect for reviving some of those forms of cooperation in areas where there is some common interest.
Well, thanks, Matt. And, just as you're sort of suggesting with that line of questioning, there really ought to be, given the circumstances in which we were able to cooperate in the past. I think, though, kind of sadly, there was more predictability in our relationship in the Soviet period during the Cold War than, there is now. It was kind of simpler times, even though it was, fairly deadly, and we seem to be locked in an existential struggle, particularly in, the arms control in your area, the nuclear field. But there was kind of a lot of checks and balances in the Soviet system. There was the Communist Party and a kind of a pretty clear hierarchy, and the kind of like the guys who did all the black ops were kept in check. Well, now the guys who did all the black ops are the guys who are in charge. There's no political party and kind of hierarchy beyond the people who are interconnected with Putin and the system that he's created. And there's a lot of unpredictability. The world is a more complex place, arguably a more dangerous place in some respects. And it's not just about the two of us anymore. And, this is kind of multi-dimensional relationship. China, the rise of China has to be kind of factored in there. That really, changes the perspective on the old style strategic stability. Space as a domain for confrontation, not just as a domain for shared exploration, that we've had over with the NASA and Soviet space program cooperation. And cyberspace is another sort of domain. And the information space and information warfare just taking all of these new turns and twists and being more amplified than it was previously. And the Russians have spent quite a lot of time trying to figure out how they can hurt us, short of provoking the kind of threshold of a nuclear confrontation or a conventional confrontation. And I'm sure you've been watching this, very closely, as they've made statements making it very clear that if we used some of our larger conventional weapons and missiles, that they would retaliate with a nuclear strike. So, making it very clear where they're really nervous. So against that backdrop, trying to kind of get back into some fashion of strategic stability talks, which got somewhat abandoned over, the last few years, although I actually participated in, some of them early on. We tried to get them going, but, every time we'd have a meeting, something would happen. Either the Wagner group shooting on our, guys in Syria, the Russians poisoning someone and, trying to assassinate them, including, kind of Skripal and Salisbury in 2018. We never just got off to the races in terms of, the discussion on all of this. And I think that skewed then all of the other cooperation, like you're pointing out. The pandemic ought to have been a fantastic opportunity to weld together, and it has been anything but. Although, I'm hopeful that, perhaps for thinking about the next phase of all the variants and, the next pandemic around the corner, that we might be able to work with them. We've seen that the Sputnik vaccine is highly effective. Something of an unorthodox approach, but that's kind of like the old Soviet approach of testing, going initial test and then right out into the public testing. But they did that with polio, and they've done that kind of in the past in the virology domain. But as you said, I mean, we've worked with them on HIV and smallpox, and even at times when they've accused us of creating HIV in the first place, they were working with us behind the scenes. Same with tuberculosis. We've got a real well of shared cooperation in the past to be able to engage on. And I think that just as you're suggesting here, we need to find ways of doing this, because we have to find some method of taking the edge off this confrontation relationship. There's no good reason for why we're just kind of careening from crisis to confrontation and back again. We need some degrees of conflict management and some kind of tentative approach to confidence building, notwithstanding all of the problems that we actually have to be clear-eyed about this. But this is the same dynamic that we had in the Soviet period. So I couldn't agree more with the thrust of the question. I just don't have any really good answers for how we do it, because obviously we're feeling incredibly pissed off with all this sort of pent-up feeling about what's been happening for the last 6 or 7 years, going back to the annexation of Crimea 2014 all the way through war in Donbass, intervention in Syria, intervention in our elections, influence, attempts to influence, rather than kind of, as Paul was saying, the interference was a little bit more tricky, but clear evidence that they meant to stir things up on a as large a scale as they possibly could, plus then everything else that's happened in poisonings, assassinations, interventions, ever since then. So we have to figure out how to push back on that. My emphasis would be on a robust defense, an offensive defense. But then we have to kind of really figure out about how can we just break this vicious cycle. And that's going to really take some major effort on all of our parts.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. So before we go to our next live question, I'll pose a question that keeps coming up in the Q&A box, which is, could you comment a little bit about the relationship between Russia and China, especially in light of the plans for them to build a lunar base jointly? Is there an opportunity for Russia, a relationship with Russia, to counterbalance the U.S.-China competitive relationship, or just a few thoughts on your thoughts on Russia and China?
Well, the Russia and China lunar base, I mean, I'm kind of wondering if they're going to, I've been probably watching too many Hollywood movies, put a giant set of Chinese and Russian flags on with, some kind of permanent spotlight, so that, even with binoculars and the naked eye would be able to see them, kind of every full moon. It's basically just to make a point. Because, a lot of the relationship between China and Russia is the product of shared irritation and with us, and also a sort of a shared sense of threat. Not, kind of a combined military threat, but really kind of the threat of sanctions and the threat of pressure, and, all of the actions that we've been taking, to really kind of curb China's predatory practices, China's exfiltration of all of our data, China's theft of international of intellectual property, which puts what the Soviet Union did back in the day, kind of in a very small place. I mean, China is the Soviet Union in all of its technological theft on steroids. And obviously, we've had to take action against this. China is the big system threat for us, in a way that Russia or the Soviet Union was in the past, but is no more. But, for Russia, there's also a long-term concern about China that's definitely there. And Russia does not want to just, become the little brother, as sometimes described, to China. They're well aware that, Chinese nationalists and many Chinese politicians tend to think of Russia as European power and lump them in with all the other colonial powers that stripped China of territory, in the 19th century. And the whole part of Russia and the Russian Far East, north of the Amur River, which is now the border between China and Russia, was part of China, Imperial China, until it was wrested away by Russia in the 1860s. And, when I talk to all of my colleagues who look at China, I mean, they describe Chinese maps with, that very clearly marked, kind of the whole China nationalist upsurge on the internet, sometimes talks about this. And again, there's not a great deal of, let's just say, sort of fond feeling on the part of Chinese for Russia writ large. A lot of memories of clashes along those border zones in the Soviet period. There's also, of course, Gorbachev helping to trigger off the Tiananmen Square, on the part of, the Chinese Communist Party, for example. And although President Xi and President Putin have definitely worked very hard on that relationship, and there is a really strategic perspective and a cast to the Chinese-Russian relationship today, there's obviously a lot of kind of lingering concerns. And, China has the ability to not just eat Russia's lunch, but also its breakfast and dinner, because, technologically, there's just no way that Russia can really compete with China over the longer term either. So somewhere down the line, Russia's going to want to emphasize, as one, well-known Russian commentator on China, Sasha Gaburev at the Moscow Carnegie Center, said it'll want to kind of be able to exercise its strategic autonomy. And, kind of at that point, Russia may regret really being in an open confrontation with the United States and Europe, because that would be the kind of logical counterweight for Russia, as it always has been. And in fact, when you really kind of think objectively about the kind of factors and the way that, the world is developing, that is the natural relationship for Russia with Europe and, the United States, kind of writ large. It's just, given all the other baggage and problems that we have, that's just not evident at this point. So, for now, everything that we're doing is certainly pushing Russia and China closer together. It would be very difficult to kind of create a wedge between them and then try to expand that. I mean, the best thing that we can do is really sort of take the temperature down if we can on the relationship with Russia and not keep forcing them, back together. And clearly we don't also want to be in a state of open confrontation with China. And, obviously Graham Allison's written The Thucydides Trap, it's kind of very complicated, as also as Henry Kissinger had said, for the United States to be in open confrontation with too many powers at once, if it's China, Iran, Russia, and others, we've got to do something here to, figure out how to manage this better. But I think the China-Russia relationship is one that, again, we've done an awful lot to contribute to the strategic perspective of it. But over the longer term, there's going to be frictions there. And, Russia may not be quite so keen on being as close to China as they are now, 5-10 years down the line.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hill. Our next question comes from William Toby. Will, I'm allowing you to talk live.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, Fiona. A great presentation. I'm part of an effort that Steve Hadley's leading to look at some declassified documents from the George W. Bush administration, and have been given the task of evaluating some of the strategic issues. And one thing that strikes me and sort of surprised me was how strong the effort was to totally rejigger the strategic relationship. The NPR said for the first time we would no longer size our forces in relation to those of Russia. The Moscow Treaty was negotiated on the premise that we're going lower. We'd like you to join us, but you don't have to. And then maybe even more compelling and somewhat surprising, because I hadn't seen these before, were the conversations between President Bush and President Putin, where he basically said it makes no sense for us to be having a strategic relationship that of deterrence. Right. It no longer makes sense that we would deter each other because we don't have underlying conflicts. And of course, it all went wrong. Pear-shaped, I guess you'd say. Was that doomed from the start because it fundamentally devalued Russia's primary asset?
That's
or
a really good,
another reason.
That's a really good question. And actually, I think you're onto something there, because of course, I was actually at the National Intelligence Council at the time. So, I do remember, very well the whole discussions about the Moscow Treaty and, the whole premise of that, which of course makes perfect sense. And then, in a way, it's what Reagan and Gorbachev kind of talked about behind the scenes in some of their summits. There was that moment where there was that sort of contemplation of, just, going all the way, which, kind of seemed a bit fanciful, but, it did certainly cross their minds. George H.W. Bush, similar kind of feelings about this. And frankly, it's kind of what Trump was talking about behind the scenes. I mean, Trump was very much coming out of that sort of 1980s, scarred and shaped by the war scare as well, and probably the Cuban Missile Crisis when he was a teenager. And also, behind the scenes, a bit of a nuclear zero guy, but, thinking about it from the from the perspective of overwhelming strength, to kind of basically show that there was just no point in this exchange. And of course, he kept saying all the time that there was no geopolitical struggle with Russia. But, because of the way that the style or the kind of the noise, understandably, and the great mess that was created by the Russia's decision to interfere in the election in 2016, it was impossible to have a coherent or sensible discussion about this. And President Trump wasn't exactly the best person to kind of carry that forward, really. But that's exactly what George W. Bush was trying to do, as you say. But I think, the Russians always think that it's some kind of, put it a bit crudely, our effort to emasculate them, because what makes them the major power on the stage is that nuclear arsenal. And so what benefit would it be for them, to, basically dismantle it all, especially when we start to think about the more complex world that we're in now with China and others. And, if it is the case that, some of the Russian military planners are thinking 5, 10, 15 years down the line, if China's dispensed the way that it has with Hong Kong, and then, gone on with Taiwan and these clashes between China and India in the Himalayas. I know if I was sort of sitting in Moscow and looking at my, kind of extensive border with China, I'd be worried. I'd want to keep my strategic arsenal. And I'd also want to probably keep exercising against the United States as much as possible, because that's signaling to the Chinese without, kind of doing something in exercises against them that you've still got what it takes. You can take on a superpower, so don't get any ideas. And certainly in terms of the INF, I'm sure you've been thinking about this, and Steve Hadley, and I'm sure Matt Bunn, and other colleagues have as well, that in the intermediate space, China is a major nuclear power. Its strategic arsenal isn't quite the same, but in the nuclear intermediate force range, China's got a lot going on and is increasing. And so, kind of looking at that as well, it seems kind of obvious that Russia was trying to violate the INF and have it, kind of its cake and eat it. Wanted to keep the United States in check, but as an eye over its shoulder at what China's doing, and also worrying about other countries around its periphery, India, Pakistan, potentially Turkey at some point, of all kind of, and Iran and others, talking about ballistic missiles, and North Korea, which is, right off Russia's eastern border as well. We always seem to forget that Russia actually has a direct border with North Korea until we see things in the newspaper, like it was recently about some Russian diplomats leaving North Korea on a kind of railway handcart. I don't know if everybody saw that. It's kind of wacky image of, some of the primitive nature of that border there. But, Russia's got a lot to worry about. And I think, the whole idea of us framing it just from our perspective and, trying to obviously, and I think very sensibly, as I think that kind of the whole Moscow Treaty and others, the perspective on that, about how could we reduce the level of threat and the mutual concerns that we have. It just doesn't factor in this increasing complexity. And we were trying to get at that in a way through the kind of recent rounds of arms control negotiations. That whole talk about how to factor in China, but Russia was very reluctant, obviously, to go down that path. So I think it'd be very interesting to see, what you concluded from looking at that, because I do think that, kind of factoring in then Russia's own threat perception and how they might have taken this is pretty essential. And, kind of there could be some really, useful lessons from that as we think about the next phase of arms control negotiations with Russia as we move beyond New START.
Thank you.
Before we go to our next question, live question, we have a few in the queue. I'll ask a question from the Q&A box. Can you please comment on U.S. and EU sanctions policy on Russia and what new directions it could take in the next few years? How do you assess the effectiveness of these tools?
Sanctions is obviously uppermost in everyone's minds all the time, because it's a kind of a tool that we know how to use, and it plays to our strength in terms of the role of the dollar as the global reserve currency. But the whole weaponization of the dollar, Europeans don't like it either, because unless the sanctions are done in close coordination with Europe, which they have been on a number of occasions in Ukraine and elsewhere, the secondary sanctions, kind of application of those sanctions, have a lot of collateral damage for Europe. And so actually there's quite a lot of resentment, particularly in the European Union, but with many of our European allies, about the way that the United States applies sanctions. It's not just about Russia, but it's about Iran. Europeans were pretty angry when the United States pulled out of the Iran agreement, the JCPOA, and started maximum sanctions because they got snarled up in this and they didn't want to either pull out of the JCPOA or apply those sanctions. Also, the sanctions that we've applied against China, I think there was a little bit more comity on, some of these against North Korea, for example, because it wasn't sort of major European investments. But with China, we've applied all kinds of sanctions against China as well, a major trading partner of Europeans, just as Russia is for some of the European countries as well. I just saw a report today about Italy, wanting to move on a, kind of a major deal with Russian business, for example. So the sanctions work and get Russia's attention in the sense of sending a very strong signal when they're done in unison and in close coordination with our European allies. But when we apply them unilaterally, we end up with a lot of friction, which the Russians can also exploit. Because we say that we're using the sanctions to isolate Russia, as we've tried to do with China, and with North Korea, you can isolate North Korea fairly effectively. If you can get China and Russia to go along as well, that's kind of pretty much done that. But, Russia, extraordinarily difficult to isolate. Russia is much more integrated now than it ever was in the Soviet period in the global economy. Russia's oil and gas sector are global players, so if you apply sectoral sanctions against the Russian oil and gas sector, you completely overturn, the predictability of global oil and gas markets or global energy markets. The sanctions certainly inflict a lot of pain and, kind of constrain Russia's ability to do things at home. I mean, they've boosted the import substitution in different sectors of the Russian economy, but they've certainly depressed Russian growth. I think there's a kind of a case in when Russia annexed Crimea and the sanctions were applied then, and then when it's triggered off the war in the Donbass, there's a very strong case to be made that sanctions applied then by the United States together with Europe stopped Russia in its tracks from expanding that conflict. Although, kind of they look like they're messing about there again, trying to stir things up further in the Donbass region. But, we've been trying to target these sanctions on changing Russian behavior. And unless we change Russia's threat perception, they're not going to change their behavior, because their behavior is basically geared to protecting themselves and increasing their room for maneuver. So why would they change that if they still think that we're a threat? And we're a threat to them in terms of our capabilities, which is the nuclear side, the conventional forces, and the sanctions and the weaponization of the dollar. And they always think that our intent, as I was talking about before, remains unchanged, that we're out to get them. We're engaged in regime control and a regime change, and anything that we can do to encircle them and constrain them and, kind of basically just stop them from doing what they want to do. So they're always kind of trying to figure out how they can break out. So, Russia's goal is on how to undermine the sanctions, how to pit the United States against Europe. And again, as I said, the only way that can be effective is when they're done in unison. So when we talk about doing sanctions, we also get a lot of pushback from the Europeans. So this is a tricky thing. And plus, we've applied so many sanctions on so many different countries and entities that it becomes extraordinarily complex in trying to kind of figure out what the secondary, tertiary, and other unintended effects of these are going to be. So, we have to kind of think that everyone has to do diligence for sanctions. We're going to have to increase, the number of people working in Treasury and the intelligence community who are working on doing all of the research for these as well. You can't just decide tomorrow to sanction someone or something, without doing a whole lot of homework about it. There are certainly areas of sanctions that have been left as yet, untrod on Russian sovereign debt, on more against, actions against the Russian oligarchs that would hurt a lot, and some of these personal sanctions. But there's always been a bit of hesitation about this, about what the implications would be and how other countries might react. Because, for one thing, if we applied sanctions against Russian sovereign debt, other countries would wonder if we're going to try to do that against them as well. And it would take a lot for countries to shed themselves the dollar, but it would certainly, in the meantime, spur kind of a rush for exploring everything from cryptocurrencies to using other currencies in major transactions that, might be somewhat harmful to the United States, to some degree or not. So it requires an awful lot of thought in application. And, I'm probably sure that whoever asked this question now think, gosh, he's all over the place on this, because this is the problem. It's not that easy to apply sanctions to get the effect that you want. And when you apply a lot of sanctions all at once, the messaging gets lost. So the Russians are of the belief that all we want to do is sanction Russia, and that they kind of just, it's like a kid being told over and over again to clean their room. I'm having a battle with my 14-year-old on this, and she's just like, just, okay, that's all you're ever going to talk about, so I'm just going to ignore you. And that's kind of where we are with Russia. Russia's my 14-year-old who is never going to pick up her socks, because why should she? And all I ever do is go on and on about them. And so, that sounds kind of trivializing it, but the Russian reaction is just that visceral, oh, you're going to sanction us again. That's all we expected. To hell with you. We're going to kind of find out a way of still pushing our interests, irrespective of what you do. So it's difficult. And the bottom line is we have to do it in close coordination with the Europeans to get effect. But we have to also be clear, what are we trying to achieve with these sanctions? Because we're not necessarily going to change their behavior, just make them figure out something else that they can do, to go after their goals while they see us as a security threat.
The good thing about the 14-year-old Fiona is that's a phase that will grow.
Yes,
out
and
of.
this one is
and I'm not sure
not,
that,
right?
and
Yeah.
This one's probably not.
Yeah. If you can see behind the door, there was a whole trail of socks. In fact, why I thought about it, I just left them there actually. So, kind of, I'll apply sanctions later, but I just thought I'm just not going to pick them up. I'm just going to leave them.
All right, so we have about 9 minutes and 50 questions left. So I'm going to do a rapid fire round. I'll ask 2 questions, and then we'll go to Catherine Kluger-Ashbrook. So the 2 questions that I'm going to ask are, 1, is there opportunities for US and Russia or NATO-Russia cooperation on climate change, especially in the Arctic? And the second question is, would a post-Putin Russia offer new opportunities for improved relations?
On NATO, yes, there should be. In the Arctic, I think the Arctic is one area that we could, look at quite closely. I mean, obviously the United States and Russia are part of the Arctic Council, and we've actually over the years found that as a rather fruitful area of cooperation, scientific and things like fisheries and environmental protection that we could expand out to the climate perspective. The Russians have been always extremely interested in cooperation with us in the Arctic. And during the period when we were having exchanges while I was in the National Security Council with the Russian National Security Council and Nikolai Patrushev, it came up all the time that they were constantly wanting us to do something with them, in the Arctic sphere, at least sort of showing up for meetings. They've got the Arctic Council this year. There is, however, neuralgia about NATO and the Arctic Council that we would have to, factor into. But, certainly it might be possible to, work with the Russians on thinking about things about deconfliction. Kind of in the Arctic and subarctic, the near Arctic, maybe on some of the individual country level, but also in this issues of climate change, at least kind of, thinking about some of the ways in which, everybody's defense forces are going to be affected by rising sea levels and, some of the shifts, and, kind of at least having some kind of dialogue about this. I think it would be tricky that the Russia wouldn't want to have this put in a particularly in NATO frame. But it might be, kind of something to sort of explore if we got back to meetings of the NATO-Russia Council about how in the sort of peripheral areas in which kind of NATO countries, are operating in, and a lot of the NATO, Arctic countries, for example, the Norwegians, they're very active in NATO, not too thrilled about having NATO in that domain, but in kind of ways in which, Coast Guard, rescue, there could be, something that we could think about in the context of sort of military deconfliction, and as Catherine's suggesting, effects of climate change and some of those negative aspects. Because NATO, just like any other military organization, is going to have to step up and deal with this over time with rising sea levels and a lot of the kind of questions about how our forces are going to be postured as we get more catastrophes and events. But I think we'd have to tread carefully there. But in theory, there's a lot of promise in exploring things that one could do in the Arctic domain with Russia in different frameworks. But the Arctic Council is, kind of a key one that we should consider, just not perhaps in the NATO context. And then the other question, I've kind of managed to forget now.
A post-Putin Russia, is there?
Post-Putin Russia, yeah. I mean, it really depends on how the post-Putin Russia comes about and who is the post-Putin. Is it, someone that Putin has selected out of his in a circle or out of the system, from a different generation, and is kind of brought forward and as someone who's sort of protecting him in a sort of quasi-retirement, and the way that we saw Nursultan Nazarbayev do this in Kazakhstan by putting in place somebody who's worked with Tokayev, the former foreign minister, into the presidency, and then in sort of showing his ongoing influence. Deng Xiaoping did something similar in China, and of course Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. And in that case, I don't know, it really kind of depends, isn't it? It's a bit like Gorbachev, kind of coming in the Soviet Union. Would this person have a different perspective, given the fact that they've come out of the same setting and the same system? I mean, actually, in the case of Uzbekistan, President Mirziyoyev, who replaced Islam Karimov, surprised everyone because he'd been in the system forever. And, kind of while I was at the NSC, people were just pleasantly surprised by how enlightened Mirziyoyev seemed, given kind of expectations about him when he took over in Uzbekistan. And I mean enlightened in terms of having a very different perspective on Uzbekistan's role in Central Asia, for example, and wanting to take down the temperature in the relationships with neighbors as well as with the United States. And we saw, when Dmitry Medvedev stepped into the presidency for 4 years, that, it was a different style, different approach, different person, a kind of slightly warmer, fuzzier version of the same sort of thing. But I wouldn't imagine a major shift in Russian perspectives. Now, if Putin died suddenly, and he's the wild card in the system because he's been around there so long, and there wasn't really a successor in place, and they had to go to the sort of normal succession mechanism, which would be Mr. Mishustin as the prime minister taking over for a while, and then there was a kind of a struggle going on around. That might kind of produce a different set of outcomes that would be just much more unpredictable. It could be worse. It could be like Maduro and Venezuela, coming in after Chavez, or it could be again, something a little different, like, as I said, like a Mazoyev or a Gorbachev. And I think that one of the big questions is really Navalny and the impact that he has. I don't know if that came up in any of the questions. But clearly, Alexei Navalny has changed the calculus, which is why he's sitting in prison and why they tried to poison him and kill him. Because, he's got traction over all the time that he has been in the political firmament now. And he's become a kind of a symbol of the whole new generation of Russians who want something different, not necessarily revolution and a wholesale change, but want a different set of guys on the top. They want to have a chance. I mean, Navalny is quite explicit. He'd like to be president himself, and he'd like to have a different kind of system, not one that's a kind of kleptocracy and the kind of, the groups of people around Putin. I mean, he's taken, a lot on himself in trying to expose that corruption of that system. And he's trying to, talk about busting that up. And, if Navalny continues to inspire people from, beyond the walls of the barbed wire fences of penal colony number 2, just outside of Moscow, does that, kind of start to create imbalance in the system and make other people who are not perhaps, Putin's first choice start to push and say, hey, you're losing your grip here. It's kind of time to go, and maybe, kind of somebody else making the decision for him. So I think there are a lot of questions that I would have here. I don't know, I don't see, right now that Russia is at a tipping point, but, there are many stresses in the system. And, we saw that with the Soviet Union. It was okay until it wasn't. But, there was a lot of evidence that there was also many stresses and strains that could, kind of provoke some kind of problem at any time. With the Russian Revolution, I remember that was one of my questions in my oral exams, that when I was doing my history degree, when did the Russian Revolution start? And I kind of went back to like the 1820s and, kind of the rise of the intelligentsia, and my professor's going, why did you start back there? I said, well, you kind of taught me that in my class. There was all these, kind of emergences of, kind of upswelling and, dissent and things. And, there's the Decembrists and everything. It just took 100 years before, the kind of the Russian Revolution actually finally happened. And, we can see all of that happening inside of Russia, just like we can, here with massive demographic and generational change and economic stresses and COVID. We're changing. And Russia was changing as well. It's not static. And so there could be some trigger, that produces a different outcome. It's the crystal ball doesn't tell me, where this is all headed, but many different possibilities to keep an eye on.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. So we're going to have one more question. Catherine, I am allowing you to go live. Hi, Catherine.
Hello, hello. Fiona, it's so good to see you. I have about 17 seconds to ask this question to get one of your juicy answers out of you. I'm asking you to wear the Robert Bosch strategic hat here in light of the EU Council meeting next week. They just announced what's on the agenda. And of course, Russia is on the agenda. We saw Borrell's fiasco visit to Moscow, the dressing down of any sort of European unity around the Russia issue. You've already talked about Germany. Nord Stream is a very sore point that will influence the transatlantic relationship. And then you have Macron leaning full body into a new relationship with Russia. So if you have Charles Michel and Ursula von der Leyen trying to tee up this conversation next weekend, what's the advice that you'd give to them to start creating some unity of view in a European Russia policy?
Well, first of all, I think, what they'll have to do is do an overview of the threat, because, the threat is really this hybrid threat, Russia in the information space, Russia in, the sort of cyber space. I mean, obviously for, the EU, it's difficult from talk about it just from the military perspective of the threat. But for the EU, what we've seen the mass hacking by the Russians, not just of, systems here in the United States, but all across Europe. In 2015, they hacked the German parliament, the Bundestag, which I know that, you're very familiar with, and the chancellor's emails. They didn't release all the information, but they were sitting on it the whole time. And one of the reasons that they didn't release the information was they wanted to play wedge politics, to kind of, keep the Germans in a state of suspension, but not, release it and harm things in such a way that the Germans would band together with the United States, for example, when the hack you know, in 2016 came along. They've hacked the French elections in 2017. And I know that Macron and others have patted themselves on the back that they managed to head that off. But, you know, how do they know they fully headed it all off? And, you know, whether the Russians aren't still in their system. SolarWinds, I think, you know, is a cautionary tale for everybody. You just don't know how extensive the Russian penetration is of your systems. I mean, we know that the Chinese have exfiltrated enormous amounts of data, as you know, said before, intellectual property. But Russia is not just in the business of espionage; they're in the, you know, the business of really trying to undermine the cohesion in societies and the relations among and between key countries, including within the European Union. You know, they have malice aforethought when it comes to the European Union because they'd like to bust it open. They'd love to have all of these divisions. And then there's also all of the, you know, the hacks of the OPCW in The Hague, the hacks of that's the, you know, the Organization for Prevention of Prohibition of Chemical Weapons that, I mean, obviously you're familiar with, but, you know, for others who don't always know the acronyms, the Swiss labs, you know, that we're looking into the doping scandal, the Olympics, the Olympics, you know, they've done so many different things like this. You know, they've paid, you know, monies to proxies, you know, trying to influence political parties, and then they've assassinated people all over the place. Yes, a lot of it's been in London, but it hasn't just been in London. There's been Chechens, you know, taking out people in the Tiergarten in Germany, in Berlin. I mean, there's probably many other examples around the country and other countries. And in 2018, in March 2018, so exactly 3 years ago, when we were trying to get the response to the Skripal poisoning, you know, we had a really hard time explaining to other Europeans that, look, you know, Russia is acting out and the GRU are running over all of your territories as well. A lot of countries did see this, you know, the Czech site, and, you know, a lot of them have memories from the Cold War, you know, period. You know, many other countries stepped up. But the French and the Germans kept saying it wasn't really happening to us, you know, kind of, well, guess what? Now it has. And now you know that, you know, the Russians hacked all of your systems, and, you know what happened to Navalny. So it's time to take a concerted action, at least to push back against this kind of brazen malign activity. And, you know, I know that the European Parliament, led by the Greens, has sort of set up a task force for this. They should set up a task force at the EU level, with perhaps under von der Leyen's office, to try to work on all of this. And at least to get some kind of baseline response to dealing with that kind of activity, even if they can't get everyone to act together on a kind of a larger, you know, kind of scale on, you know, kind of pushing back a more robust defense. So if I were von der Leyen, I would actually start going through the litany of all of the things that the Russians have done in all of the other countries. And in that regard, you know, you might be able to sort of level set this. Now, you'll always have problems because the Hungarians, you know, might not want to do things, you know, kind of where the Poles and the Balts, you know, most certainly would. But, you know, to basically be able to find, if you could sort of stand up at least a task force, the Brits did this after Skripal, after, you know, they'd already, you know, finally seen the pattern from Litvinenko and all the other, you know, strange murders that were kind of going on in London, setting up a kind of hostile state actors task force, you know, to deal with not just the activities of Russia, but of others as well, but, you know, very much focused on what Russia had done. And the EU could do the same thing. And, you know, kind of then figure out what it has at its disposal. It doesn't always have to be sanctions. This could be, you know, kind of enforcing European legislation, regulations against money laundering, you know, keeping dirty money out of the European Union, you know, tackling financial crimes. There's all kinds of tools that the EU has already that wouldn't require any additional action. And so I do think that there's kind of ways that they could be creative at this, even if, you know, they're not going to get everybody, you know, supporting some of the maximal approaches. And you could get beyond just all the fights over Nord Stream 2 by looking at this from these different levels.
Paul.
Thank you, Fiona. We've run a few minutes over, so in for a penny, in for a pound. I'm going to offer one more question to drag you in. Looking forward, you've touched on a number of the problems that we've had, touched on a number of the things you might do. Could you talk just for a couple of minutes about 4 years of a Biden administration, what sort of goals you would think are realistic to set vis-a-vis relations with Russia, and what mechanisms would you use to try to reach those goals?
Well, the first thing that we have to do is get our own act together and our own house in order, because we've proven ourselves to be extraordinarily vulnerable to outside manipulation because of just the divisiveness in our own politics. So, everything that Biden is trying to do to kind of reach out to other parts of the sides of the aisle, try to tackle our, socioeconomic and, many political problems would, kind of also go a long way to this. Is sort of kind of trying to reduce the divisions that the Russians exploited in 2016. Very difficult to do. Then, of course, there's the whole tools that the Russians have used. They've used Facebook. They've used our own social media platforms, Twitter, you name it. So, pressing on the social media and other internet platforms to police themselves and to, regulate themselves and to, kind of try to, work on countering disinformation, a kind of, I don't know, a democracy penalty that could be kind of applied against them, because, they've really helped, whether they intended to or not, to, foster the divisions that the Russians have been able to exploit. And 2016, it was Russians taking out ads in Facebook and setting up Facebook personas and using Twitter and all the other social media platforms that, facilitated the influence operation. Similarly, what we've seen on the cyber side with SolarWinds, it's been the private sector that's been more nimble and capable of detecting the intrusions than the government sector. And there's all kinds of reasons for this, and I'm not a technical expert, but I think that it's been very well covered by people like David Sanger and others in the Times. And David Sanger's obviously done a lot of work with Belfer Center, and kind of many of the people that are working at Belfer have been looking at this as well. But a kind of a public-private approach to this, within the context of CISA, the existing entity on kind of cyber and infrastructure security that we've already set up. And so how do we really kind of establish a very robust defense for this? I mean, everyone's kind of wanting us to go off on the offensive category, and that could backfire if we're not careful about what we're doing either, because every time we talk about that, the Russians will try to preempt it. Because we know about Putin, sort of you and I and many others know that as soon as he gets wind of something, particularly as we're forced always in a US environment to constantly talk about what we're going to do, and the media is constantly trying to kind of talk about what we're going to do, they see us coming from a mile off or kind of 100 miles off. It's kind of very easy for them to then pivot around, try to sort of do something that we're not expecting, or to kind of immediately try to blunt the effect of something that we might be doing on the offensive side. So we have to kind of really start to figure out how we shore up our defenses. And the other thing is that obviously we can't aim for a dramatic change in the relationship. We've got to use diplomacy again as a tool and try to meet regularly with Russian counterparts to send tough messages to them. So it's very clear about what we're concerned about and what we won't tolerate, and what action we will take if something is done, which is always better done behind closed doors. But it has to be done at all kinds of different levels, but with counterparts. And we actually had a pretty useful set of encounters with the National Security Council and Russia, counterparts there, the National Security Council. I think the presidential interactions completely, obviously a bit of a disaster, and kind of all the hot air about them, in the Trump era. But Biden, Putin, who cares if they keep meeting and having phone calls? I mean, it actually should be working at the different working level there, just like it should be in any kind of relationship. Our intelligence services, again, message delivery. We're not going to stand for this, because again, if getting back to the discussion I had about sanctions, if it's just a lot of sanctions application, we're not saying why we are doing this and what we will not tolerate, then that's useless. It's not going to have any effect at all. But we also have to take back from them and ascertain as much as we possibly can about what their red lines and security perspectives are. We have to factor in, we have to know, where they are coming from. We need those strategic stability talks to go on to kind of find an anchor for the relationship and scope that out, not just on the nuclear side, but how we could at least get some rules of the road on cyber. I don't think they're ever going to stop the espionage or the hack and release, because it's too useful for them. But we'd have to, kind of find ways of counteracting that. But we could set some rules about what happens if we detect command and control intrusions in our critical infrastructure, our electoral systems, and what we're going to do and what they can kind of expect back in return. But we have to be able to meet with them to be able to pass on those messages. So the goal is, professionalize and stabilize the relationship, find points of contact, get back to diplomacy, but have realistic, very low bar expectations. Look for a few areas, we've already talked about the Arctic, the pandemic, or the next phase of the pandemic, somewhere where we could work together with them. We could surely help with the global vaccination or the next, variants and, the next pandemic, and how we could position ourselves. Like Matt Bernard suggested, we did this before. Try to find some areas where we could have at least a cooperative engagement that plays to all of our strengths and interests, but have a really low bar set of expectations. We're just trying to look to take the edge off confrontation. It's like conflict management, which is frankly, what we did in the Soviet period. And then we just have to see how they respond. Because, frankly, over the last 4 years, they had an opportunity there if they really wanted it. Here's Trump, in spite of all the, the domestic dilemmas, was actually saying, look, I want to improve the relationship. And, kind of what happened? All kinds of, provocations, going on. Every time we want to have an arms control meeting, they poison someone or, kind of take, Ukrainian sailors hostage, shoot on our guys in Syria, which is always showing that those were more important to them than actually stabilizing a relationship. So you have to kind of test the proposition as well. My assessment for the last 4 years, it was just too tempting to play around, to kick us under the table. Kind of, they wanted to sit at the table, but they wanted to kind of kick us, kind of under it the whole time to make us bleed and bruise, because it's still part of that idea that they're getting revenge for the humiliation and the loss, where I started off with, at the end of the Cold War. And they just have not, Putin and the people around him have just not got that out of their system. And they still, see the United States through that very dark view. And it's going to take some real effort to change that.
Thank you, Fiona. I think that's a great note to end on. Just a quick summary. So what I heard is reduce our own vulnerability, engage, but with really realistic expectations, engage at all levels, not so much at the high level, but make sure it kind of in the practical working groups and practical pieces, to be able to listen and understand them a little bit better, but to be super clear about what we expect, what we want, and what we're going to do.
Yeah, this is not engagement for engagement's sake. And usually whenever anybody says that, engagement sounds positive. But look, I mean, you can't pass on a message unless you have some form of engagement, unless we're just going to keep sending them a telegram, or a kind of an ad in a paper. You've got to have somebody to convey that message. And I certainly know that when I was in the government, that's what we did. I mean, these weren't pleasant conversations with them. Yeah.
Fiona, thank you so much for your time today. Great discussion. Appreciate the questions from the audience. Caitlin, thank you for a great job moderating. And we look forward to talking to you again soon, Fiona. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you to everyone as well.
Bye-bye, everyone.